trainers and historians. My name is Krystina, and this is Effed Up Cryptozoology. This is where we talk about a little tidbit about a cryptid that's super fucked up. So last time, we talked about the Bigfoot of North America and how some people called it the American Abominable Snowman or the American Yeti. But kind of like I mentioned, there are quite a few articles I read where people really wanted to emphasize that the Bigfoot is humanoid. Like, is it? I'll talk about it. I had said in the last episode, I think Bigfoot was my first love and exposure to cryptids, but now that I'm thinking about it, and it's like Christmas time, and I was in like Marshall's the other day, I think it was the Abominable Snowman from Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. I feel like I would die for Bumble. So today we're going to talk about the Yeti, but it's not going to be nearly as long as my Bigfoot episode. But before we do that, I would like to remind people that this is the season of giving, and I have a Patreon. Please join it if you can. I have options as low as $2 and $5 a month. And while that's not a lot to most people, it adds up. I understand, though, that these are hard times. So if you can't like monetarily support this podcast, please just consider like leaving a review, because the algorithms run on that shit and it's how I get recommended to new people. Or you could just recommend me to new people and share it with your friends and family, like Lindsay shared it with her sister Bryn. I wasn't lying when I told you I would give you a shout out. Lindsay is one of my friends and literally was in like my 0.5% of listeners last year, and she just recently shared it with her sister. So it's just like a family matter over there. So with that shameless plug and shout out to one of my dearest and nearest friends aside, because I have bills to pay and I have a lot of feelings, without further ado, sit back, relax, and practice your oh good god, what the fuck faces. So the Yeti is found on Mount Everest of the Himalayan mountains, which is located between Nepal and Tibet. The term Yeti comes from the Sherpa people who live there. They call this creature Yetiiiiii, which basically means that thing. And just like the term Bigfoot, this is kind of an umbrella term that multiple different stories are all described kind of a little different. So it seems like there are sort of like three main species of the Yetiiiii. There's the Métis that zoologist Edward Cronin described as ape-like and stocky and oddly human. He said it was about 5.5 feet tall, covered in short, coarse hair that ranges from red to black. It has a robust conical head with no fangs in its wide mouth and long arms that are almost to its knees. This is sometimes referred to as the classic Yeti that most people associate with the word, but it is like red or black fur, not white, as you see in most depictions of the Yeti. They're said to be relatively peaceful and just live in the forests. It sounds really familiar to the Bigfoot stories that we've already discussed. The second one is the Zooiiii, which is described as a quadruped that can walk on its hind legs at times. So it's kind of like a really big bear. And some people think that if a creature like this exists, it's probably just a bear that hasn't really been discovered yet because of where it lives, especially when stories generally consist of it raiding livestock, specifically yaks, and leaving behind clawed prints. These are sometimes also called the big Yetis, with some reports saying that they can be over 10 feet tall when they're fully standing. The third one is the Taima, which are tiny little pygmy Yetis that are like 3 feet tall with reddish gray hair and a pointed head. They supposedly live a little farther down the mountains, preferring a slightly warmer climate. They apparently eat frogs, and Ivan T. Sanderson said that they are the most neglected and least known of the Yeti species. So the first reference to the Yeti was in 1832 in the Journal of Asiatic Society of Bengal. It talks about stories from the indigenous hunters in northern Nepal that described a large creature, kind of like an orangutan, which aren't known to be in that area. Almost 100 years later, in 1921, Lieutenant Colonel C.K. Howard Bury was on an Everest expedition where they found large, weird footprints that were like 3 times the size of normal human footprints. And the Sherpa men who were guiding him told him that it was the Métis, which this source says that it actually translates to man-like thing that is not a man. But when they wrote about it, they called it the Abominable Snowman, which is how the name started. But Howard Bury said that he didn't believe it was some kind of creature. He thought it was just a large gray wolf that made some like double tracks in the snow as it was walking. A couple years later, in 1925, N.A. Tambazi, who was a photographer, was climbing Mount Everest and was at 15,000 feet when he said he saw a naked figure, just like a human being, walking along in the snow. Its print was smaller than a man's, but only 6 or 7 inches long and about 4 inches wide. The source I was reading cites stories going into the 90s of sightings. There was an American mountain climber named Craig Kolonica who was coming back down Mount Everest when he saw 2 what he called Yetis walking together. He said that they had shiny black fur with long arms and large hands, and when he was telling people about it, he was sure that it wasn't human or gorilla or bear or goat or deer. It was something else. And the man who probably had the most reported sightings was Reinhold Messner, an Italian mountain climber, who said that in the 1980s and 90s, he had 4 encounters, one of them so close that he could reach out and touch the Yeti. He described them like bears that could walk on 2 feet. I find it interesting that the Yeti and Abominable Snowman are always depicted as white in color when everyone who has actually reported seeing one says that they are dark in color, but hey, that's the media for you. So we see different stories that corroborate all 3 of these creatures that are reported by the indigenous people who live in the Himalayan mountains, but there's never really been concrete evidence on the reality of this cryptid, or it seems potentially cryptids. And unfortunately, that is where we're going to leave it today because I have no more information to give. Thank you so much for listening. If you like what you heard and want to hear more, please consider subscribing or leaving a review or joining my Patreon. And remember, friends, history may be watching you, so don't fuck it up. And be careful of the woods. Bye!